So we're in Acts 10. We go through the books of the Bible. We're in Acts, the early onset of the church. And as I was coming up here, I could hear the excitement behind me. And I was like, I remembered camp. And I was a bit of a camp kid, but then I got to serve at a camp. I got to be the speaker. Can anybody guess what my camp name was? No, it wasn't John. Anybody guess? Bulldog. I was Bulldog. And I remember the gymnasium with the kids, and the kids talking are allowed to begin with. Imagine that in the gymnasium of 100 or whatever amount of kids. And then the person up front is trying to talk. There's that weird tension of somebody trying to present and talk to people, but they're not listening. And part of my heart is like, come on, kids. Keep it up. Let's see how long we can do this for. And then they get louder. And I'm like, who's going to win? The kids never win. And then they have these tricks. Does anybody know how to stop people from talking? Here's one of the tricks. Do you have a trick? Oh, water. I've never heard that one, but hands on top. That means stop. Yeah. Waterfall. Shh. Anybody got another quick one? These are good for my home. When I'm talking to the other adults, sometimes it's like, waterfall. Shh. Marriage tips. Thank you. Perfect. Remember I prayed about having to speak what we need to hear? I'm pretty sure that wasn't part of it. So we're in the book of Acts. This is the book of authority. The acts. So when we have the authority of God in our lives that conquer the things that we're powerless over, all of a sudden we have a new boss, a new employer, a new director, and a new principal. We are guided and directed. We are employed. And so this is the acts of that. What is the outcome, the result of a relationship with Jesus? So this is the acts of Jesus. I think a lot of people just say it's the acts of the apostles, but I'm starting to see it as this is the act of the Holy Spirit, the acts of the apostles, the acts of Jesus, and the acts of the church, which we 2,000 years later are a part of that. So in the Acts model, so far, this is what we've experienced. And 2,000 years later, most of us are experiencing the same thing. Number one, we have contact. However that looks like in your life, you may have had an incident or a scenario that somebody said something to you, or you had something happen in your life where there was contact with you in a spiritual way. You had some sort of contact. There was the eunuch in the chariot, and he was reading the scroll of Isaiah, and Philip came up and said, "Hey, what you reading?" And there was contact there. And then we have this experience. We have something inside of us that shifts and changes, and we have this experience. And I believe it's the Spirit of God coming to us. We are the little temples of God. Each one of you are little temples of God, and we come together to form a big temple today in the fellowship of His Spirit. And then we have the power over the things that kind of separate us from God. So this is His temple. He wants it cleaned up a little bit, but He does the cleaning. That's the good news. You don't have to do it. You just have to be willing and open and in position for that to happen. He's going to rewrite the script that was written for you through your previous experiences that caused your belief. And then we're going to have authority in our lives over the things I'm powerless. And then we have a fellowship that gathers around that. And then we get to be little witnesses of that. We get to be sent out and pass on a message. And we have a line of transmission that you have a different one or you have a different one. But we are agents of God's power, love, and authority. And then we are marked with devotion to God, devotion to each other. In the early church, they were selling all they had to help those in need. Marked by generosity and joy. So here we go, where we have messengers of God that were sent. We saw Ananias and Saul We saw the Ethiopian eunuch reading the scrolls of Isaiah and Philip. And now we see Peter going to be sent to another man. This is where we get into some tension. I had tension reading this and trying to study it. And I feel like I'm very black and white in a lot of things. And I would say that in this script, it changed my narrative of how things always should happen, because things could happen differently. So we have the gospel crossing ethnic lines. So the Gentiles, that's most of us in this room, I'm assuming. So that's non-Jewish people. And so they had the early church, the Jewish council. We're going to get into that later. But this was God's chosen people, the Jewish community. And so now we're seeing the crossover, and we're a result of that here today. So we have a town called Caesarea. It is 100 kilometers from Jerusalem. And then we have 40 kilometers north of Joppa. That's kind of a little bit of a map. You can Google that if you want. I didn't explain that well. And then we got a man named Cornelius. He's a bit of an important man. He's in the Italian regiment. He's a leader. He would be a Gentile. He could be a Roman. And he is somebody that fears God. That's really what it said. He fears God. So basically, he's interested in Judaism, but not some of the things that go with it. And as a man, I wouldn't be interested in that either. Sorry? I will read the text. And I'm just setting the stage. I'm just explaining who the characters are. And so he is a God. He is a God. Waterfall. Nice. It's working. It's working. So great. Where was I? So he is a man. Oh yeah, he is a man that is interested in God, the Jewish God, Judaism, but he's not interested in a couple things. One of them, as a man, most of us wouldn't be interested in either, and it's called circumcision. So to be in the club, you had to undergo that minor operation. And then they had like 613 rules plus a whole lot more about food and cleanliness and all of that stuff. So he was a man that rejected Roman paganism and polytheism. So he wanted one God with all power, the creator as he would understand him, and that's who he prayed to. That's who he worshiped. Stage is set. All right, so Acts 10, verse 1. At Caesarea, there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion in what was known as the Italian regiment. He and all his family were devout and God-fearing. He gave generously to those in need and prayed to God regularly. One day, at about 3 p.m, he had a vision, and he distinctly saw the angel of God who came to him and said, "Cornelius." This is what is important. And it has to do with why don't we hear God? Usually because there's too much noise going on. That might be your own talking. That might be your own thoughts. That might be your own belief systems. That might be your own prejudices. That might be your social media accounts. There's always talking around us. We live in a world of talking. And so when he saw the angel of the Lord, he saw a vision. So he looked and saw something. And to me, this was when I came into my faith in 2005 and through treatments. And I understand this concept. For me to stay sober, I had to have a relationship with God, which outweighed all of my addictions. And now I have this God as an employer, a director, and a father. And I knew those concepts, and I knew that concept needed to know me. So it was very important to me to hear the voice of God, but for him to hear me. That was probably the most important, because I didn't want him to mess up what I needed and the direction I was going in my life. Like, he was my partner, and we were going to conquer this world together. And so I remember my dad was missionaries, and he was a pastor for his whole life. He's got the degrees and the dots behind his name. And I said, "Dad, you got to teach me to hear the voice of God. This is so important to me. This is life and death for me. Teach me." Probably my motives were a little bit off. But the Coles Notes version is you draw close to him and he will draw close to you. And the other thing is his sheep hear his voice. So it's more about the relationship with him. And then it's like those concepts can set a stage for a belief system that God is a priority. And I hear it all the time. And I said it myself, is that God's a priority. He's my number one priority. And then you got family. And then we got school. Then we got some friends. Then we got work, those kind of things. But I'm telling you, if God is a priority, he's not in these other things, and you're not going to hear his voice in those things. And so if God isn't in all of my things, my work, my friends, my family, then I'm not going to hear his voice in those things. And I think we leave God out of those things because we just have him as our number one priority. So I believe that Cornelius was God-fearing, as it says, and the reasons why that he probably read the Torah. He probably knew the stories of old. He probably did some investigating on his own. And so he would know this story. He would know the story of Abraham or Aaron and Miriam, the siblings of Moses. And he would know these stories of old. Moses took the children out of slavery, like 1 million plus people on a camp out for 40 years out of slavery. So he knew the narrative of this God that would restore, that would take you out of slavery and bring you into a new life. He knew those stories. And so I think he had this fear because he knew some of those stories that God will provide through the desert of 40 years. That's a lot of provision. That's a lot of food. Imagine some of us. I know that some of us have to prepare food for after church sometimes, and that's a hassle. Not a hassle, it's a blessing. I'm looking at you two because you three do it most. And it's a lot of work. Imagine 40 years of that. But God provided the manna. God provided the food, the quails, and the water. And so he would know the story that would cause him to be reverent, not fearful of God, but reverent of God. And so there was a story that came to my mind in Numbers, and it was the siblings of Moses were bad-mouthing him because Moses heard God, and God gave him a wife, but it wasn't your typical wife. It was a Cushite wife. It would have been a different color, a different nationality of a wife, and they were criticizing him. You're our leader. How could you do this to our line? Like, you're definitely not hearing God in this. Like, there's zero chance that you're hearing God. And so God said, hey, you three, come with me. It's kind of what he said. At once the Lord said to Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, come, you three, come out to the tent of meeting. So they were in a culture of hearing God, being guided by God through the desert. There was a cloud and a pillar of fire throughout the day and the night. So it wasn't foreign to them to actually hear the voice of God, to be directed by God. When both of them had come near, the Lord said, now listen to me. Your dad ever say that to you? Listen to me. If there is a man who speaks for God among you, I, the Lord, will make myself known to him in a special dream. I will speak with him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses, for he is faithful. He is faithful in all my house. I will speak to him face to face in ways he understands and not in ways he doesn't understand. And he sees what the Lord is like. Why then are you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? So God is saying that I come to us common folk. I think we're all common folk. Some of you are special. But he comes to us in dreams and visions. This is how we get to see and hear him. Certain people like Moses, I think there's a different type of relationship, a little more closer. Then why were you not afraid? Why are you not afraid? And you spoke against my servant Moses. The Lord was very angry with them, and he left. When the cloud lifted from over the meeting, Miriam had a very bad skin disease, probably leprosy. When she left, it was white as snow. Aaron turned to Miriam and saw that she had a bad skin disease. Then Aaron said to Moses, "Oh, my Lord, I beg you, do not punish us because we have been foolish and sinned against you. Sometimes our intellect gets in the way of the voice of God and we judge and criticize others." There's some of you that are being asked to do things that seem ridiculous. And this was heavy on me because I can be very critical of certain leadership. And I was like, I do not want to turn white. I do not want to have the skin disease of leprosy because, and we're going to tie this in with being unclean and where we're going with this, but that would make somebody unclean. And if you were unclean, you weren't allowed to come into the temple. I believe that the later of the story that they were understood what they had done, and God can clean them, just like he can clean you and me. So be very careful of being critical to those that hear the voice of God or being guided by the voice of God, because it might not be the same for you, because a lot of us have prejudices and judgments and what things should be, how things should look normally, and God surely wouldn't say that to you, would he? Verse 4, Cornelius stared at him in fear. What is it, Lord? He asked. The angel answered, your prayers and gifts to the poor have come up as a memorial offering before God. Faith with works. Now send men to Joppa and bring back a man named Simon, who is called Peter. He is staying with Simon, the tanner, whose house is by the sea. Then the angel who spoke to him had gone. Cornelius called his 2 servants, a devout soldier who was one of his attendants, and told them everything that had happened and sent them to Joppa. Here's the invitation. And there's a lot of tension in this, because the invitation is to Peter, a Jewish man. He's a Gentile. Simon was a tanner. Does anybody know what a tanner is? Yeah, a leather guy. He was a leather guy. And he was on the outskirts of town for a reason. Because if you were touching dead animals or carcasses or skin, you became unclean in Jewish culture. And the trade itself, butchery and tanning, they were exempt from temple and would live on the outskirts of town with special rules of engagement. So Peter is actually in that environment, and he would be deemed unclean. There's a lot of tension there for the people that are being spoken to by God, because they don't see the whole picture. So Cornelius has been given a word to go do. It's action, and he goes and does it. He's on his way to do it. What I thought of is when we have our preconceived notions of how to present ourselves to God, it doesn't go well. Adam and Eve in the garden disobey, and they cover themselves with what? Yeah, apparently fig leaves are big and itchy. Like, why would you do that? Like that, like do grass skirts or something. I think it's been developed into different communities, but yeah, it's not a good way to do things. But God came down and covered them with a garment of skin. I don't know what that is. I don't know if that's from a specific animal or a snake that loses its skin, but God has a different way, and there is nothing wrong with animals. There's nothing wrong with their skin from the outset. These rules that have been enforced were put in place to keep certain holy traditions, but man kind of warps it all and has this religious rules without the presence of God. So Acts 10 verse 9, about noon. So now we go to Peter. About noon the following day, as they were on their way to the journey, they approached the city. Peter went up to the roof and prayed. He became hungry and wanted something to eat, and while the meal he was preparing, he fell into a trance. He saw heaven open and something like a large sheet being let down to earth by its 4 corners. It contained all kinds of 4-footed animals, as well as reptiles and birds. Then a voice told him, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." "Surely not, Lord," Peter replied. "I have never eaten anything impure." So what this is the Levitical law from the early days, is that there were certain animals that were unclean. Every animal that does not have a divided hoof, that does not chew cud, is unclean for you. So whoever touches these animals, they would be set apart from, they would be told that they were unclean. And that could be a couple days to 40 days to be ceremoniously cleansed again. So unclean in this culture meant defined with respect to the goal of the covenant, of the goal of creation. So that is the worship of God. Being in a state of impurity meant that you were not allowed to worship God in the community and the assembly. Uncleanliness means that you were separated from God, basically, because we had to go to the temple to worship God. So you see this, that God has his chosen people apart from other nations because they were his own people. The Lord commanded, you are to be holy because I am holy. In the Gospels, you see that Jesus starts to change the narrative, doesn't disqualify it, but he replaces it, because to become clean, you believe in Jesus and have that relationship, and he cleanses you. Because you see him cleansing the leopard. And he says, you are cleansed, go to the priest and present yourself and get the seal of approval. Jesus is saying that he's giving us the insight that he is the source of true cleansing. And that really applies to all of us. How do we get cleansed? Well, through the blood of Jesus, through the relationship of Jesus. You draw close to him, he draws close to you, and then cleaning up the temple so that we can become holy. Jesus says, I am the door. I am living water. I am the good shepherd. I am the truth, the way, and the life. Verse 15, the voice spoke to him a second time. Do not call anything impure that God has made clean. This happened 3 times, and immediately the sheet was taken back to heaven. 3 times. Peter's a guy of 3 strikes, right? He denied Jesus 3 times, right? He betrayed, he abandoned, and then again, he's like, no, I can't do that. No, I can't do that. No, I can't do that. 3 times again. And the rooster crows, and he's cut to the heart because he abandoned Jesus. But Jesus is going to confirm his identity and the relationship over and over and over, because Peter keeps forgetting, so do we. God's going to speak to you over and over and over in your own language. You might be a 3-strike person. I don't know. You might be a 10-strike person, so he has to tell you everything 10 times, but he's confirming the same thing over and over. The 3 times is really interesting because when Jesus dies, the guys go out fishing. They were told from somebody on shore, put your nets on the other side, and they catch more fish than they could possibly even drag in. And then it says this now was the 3rd time Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. The other thing that was interesting is that he had communion in the upper room the night before he died. They had communion. He broke the bread. And then on the road to Emmaus, he broke the bread, and they realized it was him. That was the first sighting. And then here in this story of the fishing, when he shows himself, they come in and they get to eat. Jesus cooks some fish, and he has this narrative with Peter. And he says, Simon Peter, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my lambs. Jesus said again, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He answered, yes, Lord, I know that I love you. Jesus said, take care of my sheep. The 3rd time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him a 3rd time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my sheep. And it's Jesus continuing to affirm that he's not a betrayer. He might have done those things out of fear, out of the tension of that night, out of saving his own life. But Jesus takes him by the little cheeks and says, you're not that. That's not who you are. You're a man after my own heart. You're a man with my spirit, and I'm tasking you to feed my sheep. And that's for everybody in here. We are tasked the same way. We've all betrayed Jesus at some point in our life, and we're all worth one Jesus. To quote Eob Mabratu last week, you were called by him, you were called to him, and you were called for him. And that's why, to me, it's important to hear. While Peter was wondering about the meaning of this vision, the men sent by Cornelius found out where Simon's house was and stopped at the gate. They called out, asking if Simon, who was known as Peter, was staying there. While Peter was still thinking about the vision, the Spirit said to him, Simon, 3 men are looking for you. That's a good heads up, eh? So get up and go downstairs. Do not hesitate to go with them, for I have sent you. This is so important to hear. Because if 3 people come up on me telling me to go with them, what are you going to say? I'm going to say, no, thanks. That ends bad. Every movie I've seen, that's not good. Peter went downstairs and said to them, I'm the one you're looking for. Why have you come? The men replied, we have come from Cornelius, the centurion. He is a righteous and God-fearing man who is respected by all the Jewish people. A holy angel told him to ask you to come to his house so that he could hear what you have to say. Then Peter invited the men into the house to be his guest. The next day, Peter started out with them, and some of the believers from Joppa went along with them. So now we have 3 men. We have Peter and a few of his friends. So you got a little group that would be considered ceremoniously unclean. That means you're not allowed to be in the temple. You're not allowed to be in the presence of God. But God is speaking to him at an unclean house in an unclean moment with unclean people. What I've learned from this is that, how many points did I say I had, Vicky? Remember? 4. No, I had 4. 1, when people see visions, they're not always clear to the one that sees it. So you might see something, you might be in this environment right now, you might have been on your way to church, you might have been listening to worship music, and all of a sudden you get this picture, and you're like, what does that mean? And then you have this inspiration, a moment of inspiration in spirit that you're like, go tell this certain person this. And you're like, wow, I don't understand why. The vision and the voice of God's not always clear. I think it's kind of cool. Like, it's kind of like a choose your own adventure. Remember those books? Yeah. It's like, now where are we going? And it's like, that's what a Jesus adventure is. You're invited into that. It's not always clear, though. I don't know what this means, but be bold and just be obedient in what you're being inspired to do. This is a big one for me. It contradicted the scripture. Because I would always be somebody, and I still am, that you hear the voice of God, you pray about it, you get that confirmation in your spirit, you go to your prayer team and go like, this is what God said to me, and they're like, no, that is so off base. Get your earwax out of your ears, or they are like, yeah, wow, that's I feel like that's God. And then we confirm it through the scriptures. I've always, that's my go-to. Right here, in the Old Testament, it's contradictory. The whole thing is contradictory. I'm not saying that just be a lone ranger and go like, yeah, I know it says it. I know Jesus says that. Jesus didn't say that. This was the old way of the old covenant. That's why the Jewish people had such a hard time, because it was contradictory to their religion. But it was confirmed by Jesus and the Holy Spirit, and others were sent. It all made sense as we put the puzzle together. And then number 3, Peter, being Jewish, invited Gentiles into the home and became unclean, and already in a tanner's home was considered to be unclean. And number 3, I thought God is not too good for your dirt. God is not too good to be in an uncomfortable place with you. God is not too good to meet you exactly where you are in your uncleanliness, because his job is to clean you up. I believe throughout the day, throughout the week, we need to practice cleanliness. We need to practice. Jesus came to wash Peter's feet, and Peter said, "Oh, I came here to wash your feet." But Jesus says, "No, you can't have a relationship with me if I don't wash you." And then Peter's like stripping down, "Go clean my whole body, sponge bath up." And he's like, "No, we have a relationship. I just need to wash the dirt off your feet." And some of us have dirt on our feet, and we just need this daily practice of getting our feet washed by Jesus, the cleanser, the cleaner, the restorer, to be in right relationship in the temple. Do you believe that God said, "I am holy and you can be holy too"? Do you believe that you can be holy? Or is God far off because of your unholiness that you feel is inside of you? God's not too good for that. And then God speaks through visions, through dreams, sometimes face to face with very few documented people. I don't even think he was face to face, but he had the imagery of God a little more clear. Through people, through angels, and then he sends people. We are all commissioned. When we get a message from God, we are commissioned to give that to where he's guiding us. And imagine the demographic differences in this room. Some of you are in high school. Some of you have never went to school. Some of you are working, or some of you are in leadership in Parliament Hill in Canada. But what's the message God has commissioned for you to be sent into those places that you're already in? And then there's listening on both sides. The speaker has to listen. So Peter listened, and then he spoke. So we get to enter into this narrative, and we get to hear the voice of God. I'm just going to call up Joanne and the band. And the group of musicians, would you come forward? And I believe that this is of utmost importance, that you really get to understand the principle that God is holy and he will cause you to be holy. As you give your full life and your will to him, you can't give half your heart. And then God will speak to you for his message to be proclaimed, for his message to transform those, to have an experience, to have contact, to have experience, and for others to be changed.